In this JavaScript lesson, we're going to talk about functions. And functions, they work amazing with the variables and give you functionality that you can call to. And just like the variables, you can reuse these over and over and over again. And it really does save you time when you're developing out a lot of code. So in order to set up a function, we declare it as a function and we give it a function name. So I'm just going to give it my name. And the way that we do that is we do lowercase. And if we've got a second name there, a second word there, then what we do is we just combine them. But the second word is going to have uppercase. So this is just a good formatting way to work with a function or have proper naming conventions. So just something that makes sense. And because you're going to be calling to these functions, it's always a good idea to be able to work with them in this type of format so that they do make sense when you are looking at them. So we also have the ability to pass through values in a function. So I'm just going to give the first value an A and the second value a B. But ultimately, again, with the naming convention, you want to be using smart naming. And I'm just going to do another variable here. I'm just going to give it last name. And again, you can see that we're using that same naming convention where if we've got two words, we do lowercase for the first one, and we do first letter is uppercase on the next one. And I'm just going to give it a value of Smith. And here is where we actually do the work. So the function can perform different tasks that can be contained within it. So we're just going to create a brand new variable. We're going to call it full name. And all we're going to do is do A plus space plus B. And that's going to give us full name. And in order to return a value out of the function, all we have to do is return, and we're going to do full name as well. So now when we call this function, we're actually going to pass through a couple values here to the function, and it's going to do the calculation here. It's going to do all the hard work. And then finally, it's going to return back that full name value that we've assigned here. So let's try this out. I'm going to put this in the output, and I'm going to do first name and then last name and see what happens here. And we see that what's happened here, we've gotten the output of John Smith. So we were able to build this function. We were able to pass through a first name, taking the variable from here, pass through a last name, taking the variable from here. And normally I would call these something similar like first name, last name, something that just makes sense. But for now, we're just going to leave it at A and B. And again, sometimes it can get a little bit confusing when we're explaining if we're reusing the same names or similar type names. But it's important to remember that this full name, it's actually not going to be accessible from outside of the function. So this, whatever variables you're setting within the function, they're only going to be self-contained. They're going to be contained only within that function. But alternatively, we do have the ability to use these variables because these ones propagate globally. So when I do something like this, I no longer have to pass it through, and I still get the same result because I'm pulling in first name and last name from over there. But usually best practice is actually in order to set this up in this type of format where you are passing through the names to the function and you're doing the calculation in the function, and then if you do need the value returned, whatever value that is, you can return that at that point. And this gives us quite ability for flexibility, because now we can do something where we can actually pass through a value. So we could do Lisa and last name. And we see when this actually goes through, we get this value Lisa Smith. And now you can begin to see how dynamic functions can really make your JavaScript as well as your HTML code, because now we've got this whole interaction where we've got these dynamic values that we can change at any time. So bringing this back to first name, we can do something like first name equals Mike. And now we can see what happens here. So we've initially we declared the first name as John, so we had opened up that variable to be accessible, and then we've set up our function here, which we're going to call to later, and then we've got we're reassigning a value to first name, and we're assigning the value of Mike to it. So now when it comes to the function, when we're passing a value of first name, it's no longer John. Now the first name value is Mike. So this is what's getting passed through to the function called myName, and last name still the same, still Smith. And all of this is remembered within the browser, and this allows JavaScript to output and work with these variables. So when we come to the function knows it's expecting two values there. So you've got to pass through two values when you use the function. And the first one's going to be A, the second one's going to be B. And here we're declaring a brand new variable that's only going to be contained within the function. Full name is not accessible outside of the function. And all we're doing is adding A space B, and that's being assigned to full name. And then finally, we're returning this value of full name, and we're outputting it here within the inner HTML. So this really is the same as doing this, but keeping it within setting up this brand new variable. Although it's another additional line, it does make a lot more sense to do it that way. And it doesn't make sense to skip through that step. It's just best practices. When it comes to coding, you always have options. There's always just different ways to do things. And most of the time you are trying to reduce your redundancy. You're not trying to add to your coding. You're trying to simplify it. But then there's also readability. And there's always a battle between readability and the efficiency, the redundancy. And sometimes that readability, just having that full name there, when you're quickly glancing over the code, return full name, that just makes sense. It's logical, and when you are returning a full name and we're calling it full name, it just makes sense. So quickly glancing down at this function, we know what's happening here. We're getting a name, and we're calculating a full name, and then we're returning that full name. And then over here, just like in the previous lessons, we're just using that output inner HTML in order to output it on the screen. So that's more viewable for this course. And the benefit with functions is now I can just reuse this function over and over and over again. I can set up new values, new variables, and so on. So I can attach dynamic content, send it into my function, return different content, and reuse that over and over again. I could even set up something like this where I have a variable, my full name, and I can even equal that to this value, and then return back my full name in the output. And we can see here where we start really getting dynamic with the functions and how we're declaring these variables. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to declare the variables. So essentially, going back to one of the previous lessons, this is still going to be a string. It's being returned back to as a string. And that's just important to note there, that even when you do combine, if you did have a value and you returned it like this, it would still be returned as a string, so this 5 actually becomes a string as well.